Latin America has been set up for economic failure, and it's all our fault. Hi, my name is Anthony Panarello, and today I'm going to be speaking about dependency theory in Latin America. I have read several articles from economists and scholars on Latin American studies, and I think that this topic is important because it is important in understanding why some countries are less economically developed than others. Understanding how Latin America has come to become dependent on certain resources and how they have stayed dependent on those resources is important understanding before figuring out how to solve Latin America's economic woes. Defining what exactly is dependency theory is important first before solving Latin America's economic woes or even going into their history. Raoul Prebisch in 1949 created dependency theory, and this is from Thomas Skidmore, Peter Smith, and James Green. He created this theory around an observation that he made, that observation being that the price of commodities tends to fall relative to the price of manufactures. Due to this, countries in the periphery are stuck exporting these cheap raw materials to countries in the core. Now, why is this? Well, for core countries, these cheap raw materials, the demand for them doesn't really change because they're relatively inexpensive. And so it doesn't really affect these core countries very much, the value of these cheap raw materials. But for periphery countries, when the value of it stays stagnant and there isn't much of an increase in demand for your good, you're not going to have very high net exports. You're going to keep producing these cheap raw materials and importing these more expensive industrial goods from the core countries. This creates constant negative net exports for your country. And that comes from Andres Velasco. Now, with the basic understanding of dependency theory, we can start to go into Latin America's history and try and figure out how Latin America's economy has come to be so underdeveloped. Well, we need to begin with Latin America's early colonization by Spain and Portugal. They mainly exported to those countries the primary commodities of food, metals, and oil. And that didn't change when the Latin American countries became independent and started participating in free trade. But back then, those commodities were relatively more valuable. And as the elasticity of demand became more and more inelastic and the value decreased, they were experiencing these negative net exports. And they were upset because these core countries were successful in free trade, but the periphery countries in Latin America were not successful. And so they wanted to test other economic systems, and that came from Skidmore, Smith, and Green. And so these socialist and communist parties would nominate for power in Latin American countries, and this was during the Cold War, so the United States did not like that. They did not like the idea of a communist country being so close to them. And so if there was a communist party and a authoritarian dictator Democrat party up for nomination in a country, they would back the authoritarian dictator. Some examples of those being Batista in Cuba or Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. And so a lot of these countries in Latin America never got to test, or at least properly test, a communist or socialist economic system to see if that would solve some of their problems, including a huge pay gap with a very wealthy minority group at the top and a very poor majority group at the bottom. And that came from John Chasteen. And so over time, these Latin American countries started to go back to free trade, with the exception being Cuba. And even though they got to test a communist economic system, they had the trade embargo set on them. And so they didn't even get to test a properly communist economic system because they couldn't really trade with anybody, because anybody that tried to trade with Cuba, the United States, put an embargo on them as well. And so going back to Latin American countries restarting free trade, it again did not work for them. And so we're at this point now where Latin American countries are attempting free trade again and are still unsuccessful. And so with this understanding of Latin America's history, I have a couple proposals on how to fix the problem. The first one being more radical than the other. This comes from Tulio Halperin Dongi, and that No Latin American country has ever properly tested a communist or socialist economic system. And that might be what could solve the problem. We really don't know. Again, nobody has tested it. And with that being an unknown, that could potentially solve the problem. My second proposal, a little less radical and potentially more likely to come to fruition, comes from Dale Johnson, and that Latin American countries need support from the United States for trade reform because free trade has not worked for them. It has not worked for them since the countries became independent. And these are my two proposals, and while neither may ever come to fruition, I hope I have at the very least shown that Latin America's economic struggles are due to the exploitation and intervention by the United States and other core countries. Now, I have shown an economic theory that is a logical explanation for Latin America's economic underdevelopment. I have gone into Latin America's history that explains more on why Latin America's economic underdevelopment has occurred, and I have given a couple of proposals on how to fix Latin America's underdeveloped economy. Now, we all have the choice on whether we can either continue to be indifferent towards the struggles of millions of Latin Americans who are in the majority of poverty in Latin America, or we can request to our politicians to loosen their grip on Latin American countries and allow them to test other economic systems, or to at least make the fair trade more fair for Latin American countries. We are all reaping the benefits of cheap resources from Latin America, and we can all become the first generation of Americans to help our fellow Americans. Thank you, and I hope you have a good day. My name is Anthony Panarello again. Here is my notes. Thank you for listening.